the Evolving Past Alzheimer's podcast, where we are focused on bringing you information to help prevent and reverse brain diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementias. I'm Dr. Nate Bergman, a functional medicine physician in Cleveland, Ohio, and your host on this journey. So, whether you're a baby boomer who's worried that your brain wiring just isn't working like it once was, or you have loved ones with the disease, or you yourself have already been diagnosed and are wondering, what do I do now? You'll want to listen to this podcast. Each episode, we introduce you to the top doers and thinkers that are revisioning Alzheimer's and dementia. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page, or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. So here we go. Let's get better. Welcome back to the show. If you have questions about the ketogenic diet, really need to go no further this week. Our guest is pretty much the keto science guy. He really is. He's a tenured professor in molecular pharmacology and physiology at the University of South Florida, Morsani College of Medicine, and is a visiting research scientist at what I think is a really, really interesting place, the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. They also have a really interesting podcast out. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino. Hi, Dom.
Hi, Nathan. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we really appreciate you making the time for us. And you have really become known for ketogenic science and sort of the science of ketosis and multiple kind of manifestations. And it just seems like every time I check in with you or I check around about you, there's more and more that you and your lab and people that you've connected with, other researchers and entrepreneurs have been doing. And can you just kind of give us a general sense of your background and where you came from and how you got into sort of this idea of ketosis and ketogenesis? And we'll get into some definitions a little bit later.
Okay, sure. Well, my background was really before grad school. I studied nutrition and biology and thinking I was going to go to med school. And my undergraduate research project became my PhD project. And I transitioned to becoming a PhD student right after undergrad and studied neuroscience and physiology, specifically the neural control of autonomic regulation as it pertains to when the brain experiences hypoxia.
Hypoxia being a low oxygen state?
Yes, being low oxygen state. So I studied the brainstem regions that control our respiratory and cardiovascular output. So sort of had to understand systems physiology and neuroscience and how the two are integrated together. And I did my PhD in a pulmonary critical care division of University of Medicine Dentistry in New Jersey, Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. They have a hospital there. So it was kind of interesting as a PhD student to be doing basic science research in a clinical department and then going to a lot of clinical meetings and things like that. It gave me an interesting perspective, from a basic science perspective. And during my PhD, I got into scuba diving, more like advanced scuba diving type of things. And that really attracted me to the lab of Dr. Jay Dean at Wright State University at the time he was there. And he was funded by the military to understand, I would say, environmental medicine. So for the project I got involved in with oxygen toxicity seizures, which are a limitation for special operations divers using closed circuit rebreather. So my project was really to develop various technologies to understand the cellular and molecular mechanism of these seizures that occur in response to high pressure oxygen. So hyperbaric oxygen therapy, the upper level is about 3 atmospheres, right? Because if you go any higher than 3 atmospheres of oxygen, it triggers a seizure. No one understands why these occur or how to prevent or predict them, except just not going to higher levels. But it's not always feasible if you're using one of these rebreathers and you're a special operations, Navy SEAL guy and your mission is to, dive down and plant a mine or evade enemy fire or whatever. You can stay underwater too long and go too deep. So they have the Office of Navy Research has an entire funding line for that. So that's what I applied for, and I hit on it as a postdoctoral fellow. And, that's what I'm kind of funded on now. Even so, I've had pretty much continuous funding by the Office of Navy Research to study that. And out of studying that, you develop, as we gain an understanding of oxygen toxicity seizures, which are just like tonic-clonic seizures very similar to the etiology of epilepsy is kind of largely unknown, but there's many similarities to oxygen toxicity seizures and many different types of seizures. So when we study ways to predict and prevent them, those mitigation strategies or countermeasures, they call it, have implications for use in other epilepsy or seizure disorders. So the research that I did on this particular sort of esoteric topic, maybe you can think about it, now has kind of exploded to applying various neuroprotective anticonvulsant strategies, nutritional ketosis, but induced through kind of novel strategies. So we apply those strategies not only to epilepsy, but other seizure disorders, metabolic disorders, specific types of cancer, wound healing, other neurological diseases like Angelman syndrome. We have a clinical trial that recently got approved. And in that syndrome, there's seizures and motor function issues. Glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome, is very responsive to the ketogenic diet. In fact, it's a standard of care. So something like ketone esters, which provide the brain with an alternative fuel for energy when you can't transport the glucose, is something that has very high therapeutic value for that disorder and a number of things that we're studying now.
And so we'll talk about ketone esters hopefully in a few minutes. And so that really is an interesting pathway. And I know, we're really focused here on cognition and neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's in particular, and then sort of kind of these multiple dementias. But can you kind of briefly describe what you mean when you say ketosis or nutritional ketosis, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and what are some of the confusions people have between that and like ketoacidosis and things?
Sure. Nutritional ketosis is defined really by an elevation of ketone levels in the blood or even the urine. And if you have a sustained elevation of these ketone levels and you do not have, type 1 diabetes, which is sort of associated with diabetic ketoacidosis, for a normal person transitioning into nutritional ketosis through carbohydrate restriction and through designing a diet with a specific macronutrient composition, and that composition can vary slightly. Strict adherence to that diet can suppress the hormone insulin, stimulate fat oxidation, in particular in the liver, and accelerated fat oxidation can generate ketone bodies. And this generally is associated with suppressing the hormone insulin, low or fairly low glucose levels. And strict adherence will gradually elevate these ketone bodies to the point where they become a significant source of brain energy metabolism. And they also have important signaling effects. They have anti-inflammatory effects. And these are all things that we are studying in the lab. And sustained adherence to the protocol has an anti-seizure effect that's not unlike the anti-seizure effect that had been observed with fasting. So fasting ketosis, which was observed in biblical times, in scripture even reported. So actually the ketogenic diet evolved out of the observation that while fasting, people in a prolonged fasting state produce these ketone bodies. And some early work that was done at the Mayo Clinic observed that these ketone bodies were also observed with a carbohydrate restricted, a low to moderate protein restriction, and very high fat consumption. So it metabolically mimicked what was observed, in the state of fasting, but you could have a eucaloric content. So basically you could supply your body with the energy that it needs for growth and repair and maintenance and still mimic this metabolic physiological state associated with fasting, and which had an anti-seizure effect.
So this is fascinating. So you're mentioning sort of a plethora of benefits, and in particular, you mentioned brain benefits like insulin sensitization and decreased inflammation. And you also mentioned, sort of to maybe oversimplify it, primarily what we think of nutritional ketosis or a ketogenic diet is typically sort of lower carbohydrate and higher fat. What does sort of a daily meal plan, it's just in general, like breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks maybe, like on average, what is on a ketogenic type of a diet, what does that look like?
Yeah, well, that can vary depending on, the foods that you like, right? There are many different ketogenic diet cookbooks out there and readily available meal plans. So for my taste, what I like, eggs are a staple in the nutrition that I have. In particular, egg yolks. Egg yolks almost have a really good ketogenic profile. And we have dogs. So actually, sometimes when I'm making eggs, I'll give some of the whites to the dog and I'll make like an egg yolk omelet. And so, which actually tastes much better than an egg white omelet. You can go to a restaurant and pay a little bit extra for an egg white omelet, but you're paying for less nutrition, right? So that's not a good deal. So we eat a lot of eggs and nuts, nut butters, fish, beef, chicken, poultry. My family hunts, so I eat a lot of wild game, and we make stews and soups and stuff out of it. My wife makes a great cream of broccoli soup and cream of mushroom soup, where sometimes we switch out the heavy cream with coconut cream. So we eat, a lot of low carb, what I would call ketogenic soups. We make a ketogenic ice cream. What's of benefit to people starting the diet, there are many different companies scrambling to get into this space from an entrepreneurial perspective, and they're creating things like chocolate chip keto cookies and keto brownies and things like that. So these are foods that are often sent to me, and I test them. And if they can allow me to stay in nutritional ketosis, I see a lot of value in that, especially in epilepsy patients and people using as a metabolic therapy. So, I'll put it on my ketonutrition.org website. I have to say that most of the foods that are sent to me, 80% or more, don't actually produce nutritional ketosis. But the ones that do, I think and many of the companies had to do a lot of trial and error to make these products, because there's a lot that goes into formulating a ketogenic diet and ketogenic foods and also making them palatable.
So yeah, you mentioned ketonutrition.org, and of course we'll put that in the show notes. That's a really useful website, and I direct a lot of my patients there when they have questions about kind of hardcore, and they're really getting into it in terms of ketosis. So you mentioned that you would test to see if you remain in nutritional ketosis. What do you mean that you test? What does that mean what are you testing?
Well, the test that I prefer to use is an Abbott Labs Precision Extra blood glucose and ketone meter. And the Abbott Labs Precision Extra is available on Amazon. It's available at many pharmacies. And it takes an assay strip for glucose and an assay strip for beta hydroxybutyrate, which is a ketone molecule. And so you can, purchase these commercially and be able to monitor fairly precisely, the levels of ketones that are in your blood, and then adjust your diet and adjust, your lifestyle to be able to hit the ketone levels that we know are therapeutic. And when you get your ketone levels up to about 1 millimole per liter, up to that level, we've predicted based on some dual PET imaging that that's supplying about 10% of your brain with energy. About 10% of your brain is actually being derived from ketones, stated another way. So that can, be a significant boost to your brain energy metabolism. Not to mention that ketones too have very important signaling properties in regards to suppressing inflammatory pathways that are pathophysiologically linked to age-related chronic inflammation disorders. And we think that inflammation too may be a root cause or be an initiator of Alzheimer's disease, especially the amyloid plaques. And the formation of these plaques may be due to impaired energy metabolism, but also inflammation, which may actually be associated with impaired energy metabolism. So many of these things, as you know, are interrelated.
Yeah, and they're a little bit tricky to tease out independently, but that's one of the reasons I like some of the work you're doing, which is you trying to language this and look at it from sort of a systems perspective. So because I don't want to move on too much after you mentioned this meal plan, sort of the ideas of things that you're eating, and of course there are many cookbooks out there and websites and other podcasts and all of it, you can find kind of what to eat to try to stay in ketosis. What about vegetables? Is there a role for vegetables in a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, sure. So the diet that I follow is a little bit different than the classical ketogenic diet, which has really a paucity of vegetables, I would say, just because the carbohydrate restriction is so high. So the modified ketogenic diet allows for more liberal use of protein and also vegetables. So I have a salad every day, and many of the vegetables that are on the keto safe, vegetables would be things like asparagus and broccoli and cauliflower, or what we call cauliflower mash, which is, when made right, it has almost a texture and mouthfeel of mashed potatoes. And any kind of green leafy vegetables are really fair game. And that could include kale and collard greens and spinach and things like that. So these are things that are always on our shopping list. And I'm actually a big believer. And one of the things I didn't, really like about the ketogenic diet in the beginning, I thought that it cut too far back on many of the beneficial phytonutrients that you'd be getting from, high vegetable intake. And I've recently been motivated to be able to design and kind of engineer a vegan ketogenic diet, which is the macronutrient ratios are going to be a little bit tricky to work with. But I think it's possible because there's a lot of people, for various reasons, whether it be ethical or they have a fear of meat, they are vegans by choice, and they would like to follow the ketogenic diet. So I think that's possible. It's going to take a little bit of thought, time, and effort and researching to come up with meal plans for that. But it would be more liberal in vegetables.
I think it would be a great service. That would be a great service. A lot of people do ask about
for sure.
that. So let's say somebody decides, okay, I want to try nutritional ketosis, and I want to measure, I want to go out and I want to buy my meter that you mentioned. You mentioned the Abbott Labs Precision Extra Ketone. That's the one I have because that's when you suggested when I first learned about this from you. And I was able to get into ketosis fairly quick, but it took me a few days and it wasn't entirely pleasant downshifting into keto. Can you kind of explain what that process is, sort of this idea of keto adaptation or shifting down into ketosis, what the body goes through and what you kind of experience?
Yeah, sure. So when you initiate fasting or a ketogenic diet, your brain is using glucose as a fuel source if you're just eating, a standard diet and not carbohydrate restricting or doing things like intermittent fasting. And your brain goes through what I call glucose withdrawal. And it's an unpleasant feeling. Some people call it the keto flu. I did not experience any symptoms of a keto flu when I started the ketogenic diet. I did feel a little bit more tired and it took me a while to really feel myself, maybe about 2 or 3 months to really get into stride. But then again, the ketogenic diet, there's a learning curve to it. So feeling good on the ketogenic diet may have been, or me feeling back to normal may have been due to just me having to make the adjustments in the diet to achieve and sustain nutritional ketosis. When your ketones get elevated, your brain kind of goes into more of a relaxed mode because it's getting the fuel that it needs. But initially, if you're restricting carbohydrates and glucose availability to your brain kind of goes through a stress response. And the hypoglycemia can even trigger like stress hormones, cortisol. It could trigger your sympathetic nervous system, and you can have like the shakes and get panicky in between meals if you go hypoglycemic. So it takes a little bit of a while for your liver to kind of ramp up ketone production, and for those ketones there's basically an enhancement of things like ketolytic enzymes and various transport mechanisms that can help your body, your brain, and your tissues use those ketones as an energy source. And that's an area that we're investigating too. We know that in like rat models that with a ketogenic diet, after about 2 weeks, you can get up to a 50% increase in the protein that's a component of the ketone transporter, the MCT transporter. So we know that quickly even from an epigenetic standpoint, a lot of gene transcription is turned on to make various proteins that can assist in keto adaptation.
And so bottom line, a lot of people don't feel great for the beginning as they're going through all of the mechanisms that you sort of beautifully laid out. And then when people get used to it, are there any sort of standard benefits that somebody could expect to have when they are on a ketogenic diet in ketosis?
Yeah, once you are adapted to the ketogenic diet, obviously it's having a neuroprotective brain stabilizing effect. And that could be, as evidence of that, people with epilepsy or drug-resistant epilepsy, they show really profound anti-seizure effect or brain stabilizing effect. And what I experience, and many people who just do the ketogenic diet as a lifestyle approach, is that you don't get like the classical kind of dips in your energy when you go hypoglycemic. So you are very metabolically resilient against dips in your blood glucose, and you can maintain more prolonged or protracted periods of thought and productivity if you're in the lab. So if I'm in a situation where it's difficult for me to stop eating, if I'm sort of in the animal vivarium or something where you're different places where you can't, have a meal, or if you're, military personnel and you in an austere environment and you have limited food availability, being able to maintain cognitive resilience or physical resilience by being resistant to hypoglycemia, by having your body robustly be able to utilize fat for fuel and use ketones as a brain energy source, if you readily can transition into doing that, that's going to have practical benefits to a wide variety of people out there who don't necessarily like to be burdened with having to stop and prepare food and eat food and clean up and things like that. So I find on the days at work where I need to be most productive, if I'm teaching and have back-to-back meetings, there are days that I do like intermittent fasting, and I do like what I call a ketogenic intermittent fasting. On those days, I just wake up and I don't eat, and I schedule my day very densely, one thing's after another. And I tend to get a lot more done, and my motivation and my flow of thoughts and even my general disposition, I feel more calm if I'm in a sort of this fasted or semi-fasted state that's achieved with intermittent fasting. And then when I do eat on those days, I'll eat within maybe a 4 to 6 hour window. Maybe I'll start eating 4 p.m. or 6 p.m. and then I'll eat dinner and just kind of graze until I go to bed, maybe 10 or 11 p.m. And I tend to feel, I don't do that all the time because I feel with my body I just can't get in enough calories. But personally, I like to do it probably about twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week if I have a busy schedule.
Okay. Yeah. And just for those that don't know, Dom is like, he also looks like the Hulk.
I would say that.
Well, you're a competitive bodybuilder, aren't you? At one point?
I mean, I do it as for recreation, but I think when I was younger, I played football and kind of really got into powerlifting, I would say, like more serious powerlifting, and kind of hung around, powerlifters. And then I got more into the ketogenic diet, gave me an appreciation for all the research behind calorie restriction too. And I started reading the work by Mark Mattson, for example. He was doing, I think he kind of takes calorie restriction to the extreme, maybe, and he does intermittent fasting. He also does a lot of running. He was actually interviewed for the STEM Talk podcast. I think it was episode 7. Yeah, I actually interviewed him for that.
I heard that episode.
And he was actually a very big motivation for me. I read all his work, and I realized that, especially in my early years, I was just over consuming massive amounts of protein, and I was eating like 6 meals a day. And it was very liberating when I realized that I didn't have to eat that much food. And, I was still going to the gym, not as much as before, but, my body weight was dropping. I was maybe like 230, 240. And now I I feel very healthy and much better at like 210 or 220. And I'm not gorging myself with food, but I'm not starving either. Like I eat to satiation. And I like feeling kind of hungry. So when I go through the day with intermittent fasting, the hunger actually like makes me sharper. I don't know how to explain it. You really have to experience it. But if you're just slightly hungry throughout the day, and when you're in a state of ketosis, the hunger's not, you don't have cravings, but you're just like a little bit hungry.
Yeah.
And the work on calorie restriction and intermittent fasting really motivated me. And I decided, maybe that the best approach, and maybe the best approach for Alzheimer's disease, is to combine these approaches. Why don't we could do intermittent fasting with, and then during the eating phase, if you want to call it time-restricted eating, during the eating phase, you could eat low-carb ketogenic and still not kick yourself out of ketosis and, and still maintain your ketone levels.
Yeah. So you're talking about combining caloric restriction with sort of a ketogenic approach to eating. Interesting.
Yeah. And when you do that, and when you do like intermittent fasting too, and you just do it a couple of times a week, you can, by virtue of just time-restricted eating, you inadvertently calorie restrict even if you eat to where you're satiated, about 10 or 15%. And I believe you get real world benefits from even mild calorie restriction. And the things that I point to are things like your hemoglobin H1C or your insulin, your fasting insulin levels, your glucose levels. And for me, the big thing that got knocked down was C-reactive protein. So that high sensitivity C-reactive protein measurement, I was kind of in the high end of normal, and now it's almost non-detectable since I've been on, this eating regimen. And I think that's going to pay big dividends in the end, especially, if your people out there may be ApoE4 positive. Yes. And we know that if you do have a predisposition, for Alzheimer's disease, you're hyperactivating like the NF-kappa B pathway, right? And we know that that pathway can decrease like sirtuin signaling, and that can kind of set you up. There's a lot of things that ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting, and mild calorie restriction can counteract, and exercise and sleep too are big.
So I love this idea of, this multi-domain approach where you're talking about caloric restriction, you're talking about intermittent fasting, you're talking about ketosis, and as well as the other kind of evidence-based, if you will, lifestyle interventions of getting enough exercise, sleeping not only enough time, but also correctly, and making sure people get enough oxygen when they sleep, etc. So where I sit, in my work, we'll talk about ketogenesis. We'll talk about what Dr. Dale Breslin will talk about keto flex diets, and he'll also mention at least 12 hours of fast. And, when you talk to neurologists and you talk to heavy duty people in the neurodegenerative disease space, they'll say, okay, that's great. Dr. D'Agostino feels better, and so do the people that he talks to. But when we're talking about Alzheimer's, when we're talking about Parkinson's, for instance, but particularly Alzheimer's, is there any evidence for ketosis in the brain being helpful, particularly in Alzheimer's or in pre-Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment types of conditions? Is there any evidence whatsoever? Because there are a lot of doubters.
Yeah, well, I think the controlled trials obviously need to be done, and we have some anecdotal evidence. One of the first piece of evidence, anecdotal, that caught my attention was the observation by Dr. Mary Newport that her husband, Steve Newport, responded favorably to coconut oil and medium chain triglycerides. And later, he was put on a ketone ester, and it was the ester that was formulated and used by NIH, and studies were done at Oxford University, and it was published as a case study. And to my knowledge, he's the single person that has probably consumed more ketone ester than anyone else. He passed away recently, but I know Mary Newport, she's a good friend of mine, and got many years with her husband following a protocol that was elevating his blood ketone levels, first with coconut oil, then medium chain triglyceride, and then ketone esters.
Dom, can you just explain what a ketone ester is?
Yeah, a ketone ester is could be a number of different kind of agents, but essentially what they are, when they are ingested, they rapidly elevate and sustain blood levels of ketones to those that are achieved only with a strict ketogenic diet or prolonged fasting. And they can achieve it within 30 minutes. And they can be elevated as long as, depending on the pharmacokinetic properties of the ketone ester. So they have kind of real world applications for providing the brain with an alternative energy substrate. And these taste really bad. We work with them in the lab. And there's also the ketone salts that have come on the market. They're even commercially available. And they are ultimately, a ketone salt is a ketone body that is ionically bound to a mineral like sodium, potassium, or magnesium. And then you ingest it, the mineral gets liberated and the ketone gets into the blood and can kind of do its thing. And it's bioidentical to the ketones that you make, really, that our liver makes. And a ketone ester gets broken down a little bit more slowly, and you can combine a ketone with something like 1,3-butanediol, which itself breaks down to beta-hydroxybutyrate. You can combine a ketone to glycerol, which slowly breaks down to glucose. So there's different ways and different types of ketone esters that you can make. And our lab is actually in the business of basically screening out and vetting all these technologies, if you want to call it that, and figuring out which ones work and which ones don't. And we test them in isolation first, and then we actually formulate them in different ways for different therapies, for different pathologies, or something like oxygen toxicity seizures. So these things could potentially be incorporated into the food itself. So you could follow, for example, a more liberal carbohydrate restricted diet that's not so carbohydrate restricted, and which I think has major benefits for Alzheimer's, and then incorporate a ketone ester or ketone salts into the actual food products. They could be engineered that way. And so that's something that we're interested too. So you could eat these, the food products, and then you would sort of artificially maybe elevate the ketone levels, which are bioidentical molecules. And kind of think of it like creatine. Creatine was kind of looked upon very favorably in the beginning, and it took about 10 years of research. And then all athletes, football players, are taking creatine monohydrate, and it's just an energy source, that the body can use. So I think the same science needs to kind of be supported for using ketones for Alzheimer's disease. Now, there's research using things like ketogenic fats, like medium chain triglycerides, have been associated with improvement in patients that had mild cognitive impairment. And caprylic triglyceride is one of them, and it's available at health food stores. And in mouse studies, rodent studies, these nutritional ketosis and ketone esters seem to have a favorable effect. So the preclinical animal models, anecdotal data, and some case reports and maybe pilot studies show that these things are sort of safe and feasible. So now what really needs to happen is that a federal organization or a philanthropy person needs to kind of fund a more comprehensive, large-scale, ideally multi-center clinical trial on Alzheimer's patients. Because the diet's too hard to follow, really.
Yes. Yeah, it is really difficult for many people. And I would argue probably the earlier that you intervene on this, before there's sort of catastrophic loss of brain tissue and brain function and sort of functional network connectivity in the brain, that would be the time to do it. As you mentioned, like one of the possible benefits of the ketogenic diet is that it intervenes on inflammation, which is an early trigger for amyloid beta, and the amyloid beta plaques that we know to be associated with Alzheimer's happen years, as years in advance to actual symptoms of memory loss and things like that. So I couldn't agree more with you that good clinical trials, the time has sort of arrived for good clinical trials, sort of ketosis, nutritional ketosis. And do you suspect I'll just share with you one of my concerns, especially for ApoE4 carriers, is in a very high-fat diet, especially if we're talking about saturated fats, there may be a dark side long-term to ketosis. It's, you know what I mean? It's if you do ketosis for 10 years, 20 years, where you're sort of in mild ketosis, are you concerned about a sort of dark side to ketosis at all?
Not when it comes to, periodic ketosis. So I think transitioning in and out may be favorable, but if we look at the long-term safety data, for example, of people using a strict ketogenic diet to manage epilepsy or an inborn error metabolism, or even something like glucose transporter deficiency syndrome, those patients have really good blood work. I mean, they are pretty robust and remarkably healthy. And, they're following it because they need to. I've been following, nutritional ketosis for quite some time and have not seen any abnormalities in my blood work. But every person is a unique metabolic entity, I say, and may have a different response. So that's why I think monitoring yourself, looking at doing a comprehensive metabolic panel and looking at liver function and kidney function and electrolytes and all these things are important, especially early on. And also your lipid profile over time, I think, is important. You may see an elevation of LDL and maybe LDL particle number and some things that from a clinician standpoint may seem alarming, but if all other biomarkers are sort of going in the right direction, body weight comes down, inflammation usually goes down, and, insulin and hemoglobin H1C are usually improved, but in some people, maybe these things don't improve, and you do have a large spike in biomarkers that are classically kind of considered atherogenic. So I think people need to approach it kind of cautiously and do a lot of self-monitoring, at least initially, when they start this diet.
I've definitely seen what you just described, where we sort of shared a decision to try nutritional ketosis, ketogenic diet, and lost weight, felt better energy. Some people lose actually too much weight, but their cholesterol is going up. And either myself or another physician, although I have my own feelings about, we're pretty particular about looking not only just at the numbers of cholesterol, but also, like you were mentioning, the particle sizes and kind of some of the deeper looks on the cholesterol panels. And within the context of the rest of the person, the family histories, and do they have a personal history of heart disease, and do they have evidence of clogged arteries and atherosclerotic disease. But I've absolutely seen it where the cholesterol starts to go up, and I've also seen it where it didn't, where it went up mildly to where it wasn't sort of a worrisome level. So I couldn't agree more with what your observation is, which is, everybody's different.
Yeah, and it goes down in some people a lot. HDL usually goes up or stabilizes, but few people that contacted me recently had a pretty remarkable decrease in LDL too. A little less common, but also observed.
Yeah, give my hopes up for that. I don't believe I've seen that yet, but what do you think about, so somebody said, well, I'm ApoE4, I don't like the idea of a ketogenic diet long-term because maybe it just seems like a lot of saturated fat, and there's decades of evidence for saturated fat and Alzheimer's and, ApoE4. But I think it makes sense to do, especially if somebody has what we might consider kind of metabolic compromise, where they're a little overweight, cholesterol's already up a little bit, they have a little bit of hypertension, sort of the classic cardiometabolic risks for things like heart attacks and stuff. I mean, to me, those are like the perfect people to put on a ketogenic diet for 3 months, like a 3-6 month, like a reset almost.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think the things to monitor are, look at if blood pressure goes down, if weight goes down, if glycemia goes down, if fasting insulin goes down, and markers of inflammation like C-reactive protein. I think it's a great approach, and it doesn't have to be continuous, but it could be a combination of a couple days a week. You do carbohydrate restriction and get in mild ketosis. As you mentioned, if they're overweight, maybe once or twice a week, do an intermittent fasting protocol. A lot of people actually find it's easier to do intermittent fasting and tell them you could eat kind of what you want within that time restricted eating instead of doing a strict ketogenic diet. So I think a combination of things could work. And for people, the average person may be a little bit overweight. I think a strategy that makes it easier to achieve a calorie deficit is very useful. And I think I've observed that time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting, whatever you want to call it, is a very useful, practical strategy for creating that calorie deficit, which we know just from a mountain of literature that calorie restriction, when used properly, has just remarkable health benefits.
So, and let's just take that for one more step. The idea of time-restricted eating, or, you mentioned the window where you might eat from 4 o'clock to 10 o'clock or something like that. And there's been more and more interest in this in the general public and those that are interested in sort of trying stuff on themselves. Do you have a sense of how long it takes to not be bothered by that kind of pang of hunger? I'll tell you, one of the reasons I'm asking this is because sometimes people feel like, that low blood sugar feeling when somebody's going into ketosis, they're sort of keto adapting, can be very frightening.
Yeah.
It's like, what's happening to me, or I'm angry, or, there's literature going back to like Maimonides in the Middle Ages, talking about eating till you're basically 80% full, that you should never eat to the point where you feel like really satiated. But in our culture, at least in the United States and in much of the West, where sort of calories are widely available, whether they're nutritious or not, but calories are widely available. I mean, you really almost have to fight that. Was that something that was difficult for you, or when you even if you were an outlier, for those that you talk to, is that like sort of a difficult thing to get used to? This like idea of a window of eating, like I'm only going to eat for like 2 meals a day or something like that?
The busier I got in life with more obligations on my plate, the less sort of preoccupied I was with eating. And the more I enjoyed the liberation of not having to eat and unexpectedly having all the sustained energy. And really that's what nutritional ketosis gave me. It made not eating a lot more liberal and not feeling obligated that I had to eat to sustain my energy. Or if you're into, athletics and just sustaining your performance. So in the beginning, it was a little bit, it took some change and some change of thought. I was really big into protein. Carbohydrate restriction was not a problem for me, but protein restriction kind of was. I was probably eating upwards of 250, maybe 300 grams of protein on some days. And, I eat half of that now and I feel great. And I feel, I don't have to buy as much food and I can get those calories, in the form of fat, which is something for many years I try to minimize as much as possible. So now I sort of feel like I'm indulging by, adding fat to my meals, cooking food, with generous amounts of fat in it. It's very satiating. And the amount of food on the plate can decrease, but it has a satiating effect. And I like that. I like not having to stuff myself with food all the time. Because I do kind of have a fast metabolism. So the ketogenic diet kind of works for me where I don't have to, spend so much time eating. And, I like it. Probably wouldn't have worked so well when I was a teenager, maybe in my early 20s. I think our bodies, especially through development, really may be optimized by carbohydrates to some extent. I think we have an overly balanced carbohydrate consumption now, but I think that, when it comes to growth and repair and signaling and things like that, I think carbohydrates, definitely give a younger person an advantage. And as we age, and this really applies to Alzheimer's disease, we progressively have decreased carbohydrate tolerance as we age. So we cannot, consume, metabolize, and effectively utilize the same amount of carbohydrates. So we become increasingly carbohydrate intolerant as we age. It's just a kind of a fact, aging, and it may or may not be due to a decrease in muscle mass. I think there's multiple factors contributing to that. So the implication is, I think carbohydrate restriction really goes well with aging. I think it should be part of, as we age, we should think about modifying our diet such that it's not like it was when we were in our teens and 20s.
Yeah, and potentially modifying our eating windows as well. Yeah, for sure. It does make sense. I'm going to go to ketonutrition.org, which is your website, and I'm going to get a lot of good starting materials. They probably need what? They probably need a ketone meter. You mentioned the Abbott Labs Precision Extra, and we'll probably put a link to that on like an Amazon or something. And the show notes, they need, the lancets so you can prick your blood. They need the testing strips, like you mentioned, both for ketones. Those could be a bit expensive, by the way, just so people, I know but those can be a little expensive.
So I have something to add to that. So there's a new product that I've been using called the Keto Mojo. And there's a link to that on the homepage to ketonutrition.org. And we compared that to the more expensive Abbott Precision Extra, and it's very equivalent. So that's the benefit. So the Keto Mojo, I think the strips are about $1 a piece instead of like $3 or $4 a piece. So try that. I have a discounted link on the homepage of the Keto Nutrition website. So now we are kind of switching over to using that. But we actually have to do, if we use this for publication, we have to do a pretty comprehensive comparison. But I've taken dozens, if not hundreds of measurements using it, and it compares to the Abbott Precision Extra.
Okay, well, that's great. And then what labs? You mentioned maybe a complete kind of metabolic profile where you're getting liver function tests, you're getting electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and your creatinine, so your kidney function. You mentioned maybe a CRP, so a C-reactive protein, which is a marker for inflammation, probably a hemoglobin A1C, as well as a fasting glucose, which you'll get in the CMP, as well as probably a fasting insulin would be useful, as well as a lipid profile. And preferably if you can get it, like a lipo, like an NMR, advanced lipoprotein profile, you can ask your doctor about that. But
Yeah.
is there anything you would add to that sort of starter panel for somebody that's interested in sort of seeing what their numbers do on a keto diet?
No, I think that pretty much covers the ground. For a person to monitor themselves, I think just looking to see how your blood glucose changes throughout the day, what your fasting glucose levels are, and maybe more important is your postprandial excursion, in glucose. After you eat, I've seen people shoot up to 300-400, and that can do some damage, if that continues to happen. So you want to, buffer that, attenuate that, and really the ketogenic diet, if it, completely abolishes or significantly attenuates that really big spike in glucose following a meal, the ketogenic diet's very effective for reducing that postprandial rise in glucose and insulin. So I think a simple blood glucose meter, along with ketones too, is a very powerful tool. And what you mentioned, that the C-reactive protein is too, the HS, the high sensitivity C-reactive protein, is I found to be a very useful marker. And I no longer have to pop, NSAID drugs like I did years back, especially if I was training or something. I was constantly sore. So I don't have that anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing is, people need recipes. Do you have a favorite cookbook for starters and for somebody starting out? Recipes, list recipes?
Yeah, there's many different books that I have. Actually, I think you'll find some books on the ketonutrition.org website. But man, I think I have a dozen keto cookbooks in my office right now or more. And I would just say kind of go to Amazon and look through the reviews and look through the pages. They're all really good. Like I can't even, pick a favorite because many of them are really good.
Yeah, so you'll see, if you look on the website, ketonutrition.org, you'll see under resources, you'll see a bunch of books. It's really good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. There are a couple of sort of a little more esoteric concepts that have been kind of applied or attributed to ketosis around like longevity. And perhaps this has to do to a certain degree with the caloric restriction, but I know more and more people are interested in the idea of ketosis and certain medications like metformin and longevity. Do you have any comments on like ketosis and longevity?
Yeah, that's a big topic, an emerging topic, I think, in different areas of research too, and from entrepreneurial folks too. It seems to be coming out of like Silicon Valley too, this longevity interest. I will say from my perspective in just doing rodent model studies, we do see a pretty remarkable effect at calorie restriction. We knew that for many years. So what is kind of the newer data that's emerging, and a couple studies in cell metabolism show this, that a ketogenic diet can suppress the formation of spontaneous tumors, but also prevent cognitive decline associated with aging. And there was a study that was done with a ketogenic diet, but they also did, and might be kind of a more interesting study for your audience, is that they did 1 week ketogenic diet, 1 week kind of standard rodent chow diet, which is carbohydrate based, 1 week ketogenic diet, and alternated every other week. And I would have in years ago, I would have never really thought that would produce favorable benefits, but they found that many of the benefits was achieved with this alternating, ketogenic diet. And I don't believe there wasn't a significantly increased effect on lifespan, but there was on health span. So instead of, these age-related sort of things popping up like tumors and, impairment of physical function and cognitive decline, they happen later on. And that's how we want to live.
Right, exactly. Pushing off the moments of first infirmity,
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like just delaying. So I want to live like Jack LaLanne. We live super, super healthy and then like basically sneeze and die, and get pneumonia and die in that same day or the next day. That's like the ideal, right?
that health span. So prolonging our health span, I think, needs to focus on that. I know advances in genetic engineering, maybe CRISPR and other technologies, I think that's long off. A lot of people are shooting for that. But in the meantime, we can empower ourselves with what we know. So mild calorie restriction, ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting, all these things, not only the science is there to support longevity effects, but generally speaking, you're going to feel better too. If you feel better, you just get more out of life. And I think you are also setting an example too. So for, a lot of parents contact me and they have kids that even have maybe behavioral disorders, ADHD, things like that. And they're following the ketogenic diet rubbed off on their kids. So their kids, and that's a big problem, kind of obesity in children and, changing eating patterns. And if the parents do it, I see that, that catches on with the kids, and that's going to have a big impact. We really need to focus on our youth and educate them with nutrition, and nutrition is really not emphasized, in med school or other things. So kids growing up, when they see the doctor, they're not really focusing on giving them good nutrition.
Not at all. It's 100% true. I think about that like every day with my kids, my wife and I do. The last thing, and it's semi-related, that I wanted to ask you about, and we had a doc on the show that I think is a Scott Scher, who's very interested in hyperbaric oxygen, and he was talking about sort of maybe some potential synergies between hyperbaric oxygen therapy and sort of a ketogenic diet. Why would this be something that might be sort of synergistic in their effects together?
Yeah, the dosing matters. So I'm funded to study the negative effects of high pressure oxygen on the brain. But when we do mild hyperbaric oxygen therapy, oxygen is a very powerful stimulant to the brain. And it's so powerful, it can trigger a seizure, But just like if we take a stimulant, too much of it can cause a seizure. If mild hyperbaric oxygen is employed, especially in the context of nutritional ketosis, you are supplying oxygen and you're supplying substrate, which is ketones, which make energy. So oxidative, metabolism is the main way our brain, makes energy. So you're supplying it with a fuel and you're supplying it with oxygen, which is required to, convert that fuel into ATP, our energy currency. So theoretically, you can sort of stimulate brain energy metabolism when you do both together. And we also know that hyperbaric oxygen stimulates, for example, the production and the release of stem cells in the body. And that's a whole field. I study it, but I still don't understand it. And we know that these stem cells, for reasons we don't fully understand and appreciate, they have anti-inflammatory effects on the body. And they can augment and stimulate the immune system in ways that can be beneficial for us. So there are many different, aspects of hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Of course, it's used for 14 different FDA-approved applications. Enhancing brain energy metabolism for Alzheimer's is not one of them, but it's anecdotally, people email me all the time and they're like, I did this and that, and I couldn't remember anything, and here's my cognitive scores. Then I started doing this and hyperbaric oxygen, and now, I can do all these things I couldn't before. So I get quite a few emails like that, and haven't formally studied that, but we have studied the beneficial effects of hyperbaric oxygen therapy in animal models of cancer. And it really does seem to blast cancer cells, especially in the context of the ketogenic diet. So it's sort of toxic to the cancer cells at low levels that are not toxic to healthy cells. So that's a big thrust of what we're doing now too.
Yeah, that's amazing work. So anybody that wants to learn about your work, ketonutrition.org, is there another place that you would recommend they go to learn about your work?
No, I think that pretty much is all the information is compiled there, and reminds me I need to revisit it and load up all the different podcasts and things that I've done, and maybe some of the keto book. Yeah. And also the go-to food. So of all the questions I get, I probably get the most. It's like, what keto foods do you recommend? Well, I tried a whole bunch. About 10% of what I like is on the front page of my website. It has some links on there of stuff that I kind of vetted out. So yeah, now that I'm finally kind of back in the office every day from travels, I'm going to kind of load up more food-based things, that your audience may enjoy, whether it be, I'll try to dig up information too that's free, right? There's books that you can buy online too, but a lot of good go-to resources too that you can find. So people send it to me all the time, but yeah, ketonutrition.org is kind of like the one-stop shop.
You're like just a wealth of keto information. It's unbelievable. Thank you for spending your time talking to us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So that's our episode. I hope you guys got something out of that. Check the show notes out on iTunes or on our website where we've summarized the key points. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page. Or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. Finally, if you find the information here valuable, please consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and leaving comments in the comments section. It will really help us bring this message to as many people as we can. Thanks, and talk to you next time.